So I view this session more as an opportunity to just share some lessons in the context of experiences I and my colleague Shivani have had. But really, I view this as a way for us to have a discussion about strategies that we can mutually share together. Let me just introduce myself. I should have done that earlier. My name is Rajesh Vedanthan. I'm a cardiologist by clinical training and the director of the Section for Global Health at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine in New York City, USA. Most of my research has been in the area of cardiovascular implementation research, how to deliver cardiovascular care in low-resource settings, primarily with partners from Moi University in Western Kenya with the AMPATH partnership. I have a few slides to share, just to sort of go over a few very basic ideas and lessons that I've learned in the context of my trials and tribulations with grant writing. But as I did mention, my anticipation is that many of you have also already been very successful, and maybe we can use this opportunity to share best practices and some lessons and thoughts from all of us together. And as Pulang mentioned, I'm very happy to entertain questions, and so feel free to raise them in the chat box or the KaiStorm platform, and Pulang will be able to relay them to us. This is, as I said, my thoughts on grant writing. No corporate disclosures. These are some of the National Institutes of Health USA, as well as American Heart Association grants that have informed some of the lessons that I will be describing today. So the 5 lessons that I've learned, one is really about allocating enough time. And so obviously here in this case, the RFAs have already been released a couple of weeks ago with due dates at the end of November, early December. So that gives us essentially about 4 months to work with. Which is actually a decent amount of time, but really the ball has already started rolling, and so important to sort of be very time efficient and to be very good about planning in terms of time allocation. Second lesson is what I like to call write, review, revise, and rewrite. I'll go over that in more detail, but the idea is that this process involves having to rewrite so many different versions, get feedback from collaborators, co-investigators, other readers, etc., and just going through this iterative process of over and over and over and over, rewriting and revising. A third lesson I've learned over the years has been this idea of getting a coach who may not necessarily even be within your field, may not necessarily be strictly relevant for this particular set of RFAs or this particular grant application, but is able to provide you with sort of much broader guidance, and is able to sort of really be critical of some of the things that you've written or are thinking about in a way that's obviously respectful, but that you'll be able to take into account as you continue to put together your this grant application and the future ones as well. Lesson number 4 is having multiple readers and reviewers, and in particular from fields that are outside of the field of study and outside of the content area of your expertise and the content area of the grant application. I'll go over that in more detail. And number 5, probably actually should be number 1, is don't be afraid of failure. The percentage of successful grants is extremely low. That's across all individuals, and to be honest with you, even from within an individual. I've been invited today, quote unquote, as a successful grantee or having been successful in grant writing before. But to be honest with you, my hit rate is extremely low also. I've put in probably 20 grants and gotten 3 or 4. And so I've been successful for a few, but I've been unsuccessful for many. And I think that's the reality for many of us, if not all of us. And I think very important to not be afraid of failure in the context of this endeavor. So let me just very quickly get started. I think lesson number 1, as I said, was really about time planning, and really allowing sufficient time. And this is about being able to sort of think through ideas carefully. The actual writing itself takes a lot of time. The scheduling meetings with collaborators and co-investigators also takes time, and even just coming up with a a time slot that works for people in potentially different time zones in different parts of the world can be very challenging. Even reading through the RFA or the program announcement and really getting familiar with the details can take time. These RFAs are extremely densely packed. As we know, today's session is the first session of 10 different 2-hour-long sessions happening over the next 2 weeks. All of that obviously takes up a tremendous amount of time, plus the videos that they're encouraging us to look at and whatnot. And so the idea of really sort of planning out time to be able to absorb all of the detailed instructions, to think about how you want to present your science, to actually put the science down. And then actually, to be honest with you, there are a tremendous number of other documents other than the science, which is important. So create a timeline for yourself, create a checklist, which is very important, and go over that checklist over and over and over. And let me give you a couple of examples of this checklist. This is a checklist I used in the context of one of my previous grants, which was actually a career development award. This is actually, to be honest with you, only half of the checklist. And you can see here, this includes reading the program announcement, what's called the SF 424, which is the NIH's sort of rules and regulations in general for grant writing, and many of the instructions about formatting, about content, about what needs to be included, what cannot be included are all in there. So reading that, very important. Bio sketches, not only for yourself, but for all of your co-investigators and collaborators. Thinking about the specific aims. Oops, something happened there. The specific aims, the research strategy. In this case, I had a career goals and development plan, but you're going to have letters of support. You're going to have institutional letters, resources and facilities, human subjects section, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There will be many, many different line items. Let me give you another example of a more recent one. And here we had listed, for example, the actual specific RFA at the top, the institute in the second line, the due dates, the institutional due dates, which are actually prior to the official due date to the National Institutes of Health. So very important to think about your own internal institutional deadlines. And then again, the different actual documents all listed in line item form, who they're assigned to, what is the status, what is the current action item status, what are the details required. And this type of checklist we put together at the very beginning of each of our grants, and literally every week we're going through and making sure, is the person assigned the appropriate person, what is it that I personally have to do, what is it that other people have to do, what can we consider final and done, what do we need to continue working on. So very important, I think. Obviously, all of these by the end should all be final or complete, but some sort of organizational system like this, I think, is very important for everyone to have. Lesson number 2, as I mentioned, was this idea of write, review, revise, and rewrite. And here I just have a screenshot of my folder on my computer of just the specific aims for my career development award. So one of the grants that I was successful at a few years ago. And you can see here that I went through between the months of December to March, so 4 months, I went through probably about 50 different versions of the specific aims and literally just kept on writing, reviewing, revising, rewriting. And you can see that by the time I got to my final PDF form up here, I've gone through about 50 different versions of this specific aims. And this is going to be true for nearly every single grant application. And so this idea that it cannot just come out at once magically, but requires a tremendous amount of iterative work, I think is very important. Get a coach. And here I'd like to just highlight that on the far left here is my coach. Marty is his name. And Marty is actually a basic scientist. He doesn't work in implementation research, doesn't work in Kenya, where I've been working for the past decade. But he was very insightful in terms of thinking about career development and was very instrumental in helping me think through my career development award. And then subsequent independent investigator R01 awards or U01 awards that I've put together, I've had him read almost every single one of them. And he goes through and literally redlines everything and just tells me, hey, Rajesh, you're thinking about this in completely the wrong way, or hey, Rajesh, you're not being clear at all about how this should be presented or how this should be thought about. He gives me very, very honest feedback, helps guide me. I think very important to think about in terms of this coach person, someone you can trust, someone who you're able to take negative, constructive criticism and feedback from, but someone who has obviously your best interest at heart and who you know that is true about, so that it's easy for you to sort of take in some of that constructive criticism, because it can be challenging. And I think very important for you to find someone you can trust who can help sort of guide you through, again, not just one specific grant application, but probably several over the course of your professional career. And I think very important similarly is to think about having, in addition to your professional network of co-investigators and collaborators reading and commenting and providing suggestions on your grant application, is to think about having a variety of non-health disciplines. Folks from a variety of non-health disciplines actually take a look at your application. So my wife works in finance and banking. I've had friends who work in business consulting. I've had friends who are historians, a children's book editor, folks who are educators and teachers, read through my grant applications and make sure that what I'm trying to convey actually makes sense. Many times, folks on the review panel may not necessarily be 100% cognizant of exactly the content that you're trying to describe, or the setting, or the context that you're going to be working in. It's very important to be able to say to someone who's not totally familiar with your area of work, hey, am I making sense? And I think very important to have that commentary and feedback come back to you before it gets sent to the review committee. Because again, these people generally will have your best interests at heart, and it's better to have an internal review, in a way, quote unquote, before you're sending it out for external review. And finally, this idea of don't fear failure. As I mentioned, and I showed at the beginning of the presentation, obviously I've had several federally funded grants that I've been fortunate enough to be able to be awarded. But to be honest with you, I've applied for so many more. And so for every success, there's been actually several different failures. And you can see here that in 2019 at the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, which is the primary institute that I applied for grants to, the percentile cutoff for successfully funded grants is extremely competitive, 16th percentile. I mean, that basically means you need to have a near perfect application, and it's very different, and also luck in terms of who is reviewing your application, that they actually understand and gel with what you're trying to propose. And so it's very difficult to meet that threshold. And again, in this type of work, we all have to develop thick skin and sort of soldier on and say, you know what, even if I wasn't successful the first time, I believe in what I'm trying to do. I believe in the science. I believe in what I'm trying to put forward. And I'm going to continue with those efforts, and you will ultimately become successful. So I just wish to formally acknowledge several of my collaborators and co-investigators on several of the different projects that I've been working with. And thank you. I don't know if Shivani has joined, and I can hand over to her at this time.
So I'm Shivani Patel. I'm an assistant professor in the Hubert Department of Global Health and in the Department of Epidemiology at Emory University. I'm also adjunct faculty at the Public Health Foundation of India. I focus mostly on cardiometabolic diseases. I'm formally trained as an epidemiologist, so my role on a lot of these projects is to design the study, provide guidance on statistical analysis and data interpretation, and then participate in the science in the ways that all clinical investigators and more data-driven investigators do. So with that bit of background, what I wanted to talk about today is sort of everything that happens before we get to the stage that Rajesh just walked us through. So what happens before we have a grant in process, a grant in play? So the anatomy of a global research partnership that is ready for funding success. So, I would say that there are three major building blocks. So it takes good people, good ideas, and sufficient resources. And just to talk a minute about the good people. So the good people, of course, good is a very general term, but what I mean by that is the right people, the right fit for the question, the right fit for you. And building a global research partnership is a lot of hard work. If you can just imagine if Rajesh had 40 versions of his specific aims for just one project, the number of emails that must have been generated in that process of generating those aims documents. And for each one of those emails, there's someone on the other side who needs to respond, someone on the other side that needs to be engaged, et cetera, et cetera. I imagine that many of you are attending this session because you're still somewhat early in your careers with either respect to the global research partnership aspect and or the funding aspect. So I just want to really emphasize the importance of building those social connections with your partners, because without that, it's really, really hard to get anything done. And thinking about the different kinds of skill sets you need. For example, again, Rajesh alluded to the importance of having sort of different kinds of people read your grant, but even before you get to that stage of review, having people on the team that are skilled with respect to the administrative part. And so these are people who need to be very well organized, very well coordinated. There was a question in the chat session on developing data tables for NIH grants that require trainee information and that kind of thing. So, you probably don't want to have a clinical investigator develop data tables. You need to find a strong administrative anchor for that kind of work, someone who's super well organized. And I can share with you that we've gone through a variety of systems, and one system that you could try in your setting for whoever asked that question is maybe a Google form. And a Google form can help one organize all of the questions that need to be answered. And then it also helps on the receiving end, all of the data to be organized. So then you can go ahead and quickly produce those tables. In the absence of that, it is just a lot of work. And even with the Google form, it's just a lot of work. And I always tell colleagues who are new to the, especially NIH grant process, that maybe 50% of your time goes in science, another 50% goes in all of the administrative components. So I apologize if Rajesh already covered some of this. I joined a little bit late, but I just want to emphasize the importance of having not just good scientists on board, but also people who can help with things like administrative coordination. Finance is a really important part. So as you can imagine, wherever you sit, I imagine you are used to going through a lot of formalities when it comes to anything dealing with money. And so it should be no surprise that the US federal government is the same way. They have very high expectations for reporting, for formats, et cetera, et cetera. So having someone on the broader team that can do that. And one model that we've seen that really works is trying to pair the right person with the, say, US counterpart. So for example, in our India-based work, our finance people are in touch with our India colleagues, institutional finance folks. Our administrative coordinators are put in touch with the administrative coordinator on the India side. And there's a lot of mutual learning that happens through that process. And I just can't emphasize enough how important all of these things that are not science become to the team building process and team success. The statistical component, so because this is a data science initiative, I don't think I need to convince you on the importance of having appropriate statistical and data management expertise, but of course, you need to do that, and sometimes that's something that is lacking at institutions that are known for clinical excellence. And then the science, and I don't need to get into that. You're going to have a lot of different kinds of institutional players, and getting to know one another's institutional settings is really important. So I think building that partnership is also about understanding the constraints and enabling factors on both sides. And just the way that global health works, so often we can't just delegate and have very discrete bins that, okay, this this is your problem, or you know, I solely can take responsibility for Y problem. You know, that's not usually how it works. We oftentimes have to get involved with processes and procedures and help one another out, right? So just it's really helpful to understand what kinds of institutions are at play. There were also some questions on the chat, I think, about translation, or at least I took it as, there was a question on the last mile, and I don't know if that was it's a specific term that was used that I'm, or if you're talking about sort of the general concept. So in the general concept, if we're talking about, say, translation work, having non-scientific partners that could be helpful for the program implementation are also critical when we're thinking about things like that. There are going to be different kinds of personalities and different kinds of hierarchies to deal with, and you, I'm sure, are very familiar with your own institutions, your own disciplines. Many people find the American system to be more flat in terms of the hierarchical system, but not always. So, you know, I think you have to understand how other teams work, but also understand your own constraints. And building that mentorship team, as Rajesh mentioned, is not only important for a specific grant, but it's also critical for you as a scientist building a portfolio of research. And I would say, you know, it's building a mentorship team and an advising team. So it's really important to find people at all different levels. So it's invaluable to have a very senior investigator who can open doors. Oftentimes, those people can also help with regulatory issues and concerns in country, provide really high level scientific inputs. But those folks may not know what it's like to be an investigator who's just starting out. So I think, you know, you want those super senior people. You also want some mid-tier people who are maybe just 4 or 5 years ahead of you, who kind of are where you want to be in some years. And then it's also really important to have a network of colleagues that are your peers. And I think that having these sorts of inputs and mentors and advisors at all different stages will really help you round out your own vision and help you kind of improve, not just on the science, but also on the process side. Honest communication is critical to any partnership, global or otherwise, but I think that because of the barriers, the geography, the time zones, there can be cultural barriers, that honest communication might even take more work in global partnerships. And, you know, sort of sidestepping a problem today is probably going to not suit anyone, because that problem will come back tomorrow. So being honest, being timely in your communication is, I think, is a really foundational aspect of building your research partnership and finding the right team. Some of the barriers I mentioned, like time zones, you know, they can also work to your favor. So I'm sure Rajesh has had a lot of experience, and I have, where I will be working during my daytime on a proposal, and I pass that science on to my colleagues in India, who then work on it during their daytime while I sleep, right? So then you're able to actually work literally 24 hours a day on a proposal during crunch time. So I think that some of these barriers can also be, you know, transformed into strengths. Another example is just all of the cultural nuances. You know, a lot of literature from the business side and the management side suggests that diversity in thinking is really what drives new ideas, new innovation, right? And so that's one of the big motivations for this kind of global science. So, you know, let some of these differences work for you. Trust is a critical component of these partnerships, and I think it's maybe too much to ask for friendship from every partnership, but I really encourage you to try and find ways of fostering that friendship among your partners, because that's just going to make the partnership a lot more sustainable. And related to that is it's reciprocal engagement. So finding the people who are interested in what you're interested in, who can, you know, contribute to your areas, but also, you know, you'll probably find the most success when you're in a position to contribute back. So that's a bit of what I mean by reciprocal engagement. And what I've shown on the right-hand side are just like a snapshot of several studies that my team, my broader team has done in India around cardiometabolic disease, interventions and implementation science around cardiometabolic disease interventions. And I haven't been a part of a very close part, at least, of most of these studies. But yet, because I was working in this team environment, when we got together for the next step, I was brought into the fold. And I think that that's another thing that you can be looking out at, you know, different stages of your career, that who are the teams working on the things that you find interesting, where you want to see your career going. And early on, that can be a great place for you to try and make some inroads. Good ideas, of course, they need to have local relevance, but the other critical factor is scientific contribution. You'll hear a lot about this, I'm sure, from the NIH folks as well, that whatever you do, it can't just be replicating a study for the first time in your setting. We're ultimately interested, or rather NIH and other funding bodies are generally interested in funding research that's going to make a broader scientific contribution. So figuring out that sweet spot between what is locally relevant, what can make a broader scientific contribution, what has potential for translation, potential for real impact. So it's not just a cool, nerdy scientific question, but it can also change lives because we are working in health, which is a field that's inherently applied. And finally, I'll say, where do you have a strategic advantage? And by strategic advantage, I'm talking about things like, say, it might be a really unique exposure distribution that is not possible to study in a place like the United States. Or it might be just the ability to recruit large numbers of people quickly and efficiently from existing population registries for a particular study in a way that cannot happen or be replicated in other settings. So really looking for those win-win-win situations where your interests are served, but you're also making a contribution that's going to be valued globally. And then I think, as Rajesh pointed out so nicely, it's also thinking about how all of this fits into your career trajectory. So what are, and also the trajectory of the team. So what are the areas that have opportunities for growth and expansion for you personally, and also for your broader team? And what I've shown here on the right side is just an example of a cohort that I work with in India, focused on cardiometabolic diseases. And what we've done is, you know, the local relevance bit was the fact that there at that time had been no such sort of India-based Framingham that had repeated metabolic data collected year after year on participants. So despite having a really high burden of diabetes and early cardiovascular disease in India and in Pakistan and other South Asian countries, we really didn't know too much about what was driving that risk or what was driving progression in that risk. And so developing this cohort was of local relevance, but it also became a springboard for scientific contributions related to unpacking what was going on in that area. And I think that's why we've been a bit successful there. And then sufficient resources. So all of this takes it takes financing. And I don't, you all are here because you know this, right? Global research is a small business. And it's a necessary component of the current research environment. I think Rajesh has beautifully covered you know, what it takes to win a grant, so I'm not gonna repeat that here. And I was going to go through a case study from one of our team projects, but I think I'm going to just pause here and see if there are questions, because I think we have less than 10 minutes left. So I'm going to end my remarks right here and open it up for questions from the chat room and others.
It would be great to have a look in the chat. You have a couple of questions perhaps to respond to some of those questions such that it helps everybody else.
Poolan, can I jump in for a minute? Is that okay, Shivani?
Yeah, please.
Yes,
Please.
both of you just
There was a question asked about quote unquote common mistakes that are made that we could try and avoid. From my perspective, I think quite challenging, but I think one of the sort of common mistakes I've made in the past has been this idea of not being clear enough in the actual grant proposal itself. I may feel like the idea is very clear in my head, but if I'm not able to take that idea and make it very clear on paper, that has sometimes, I think, been a critical mistake. And that's why I think, again, having a bunch of different people from different perspectives read your writing to be able to say, oh, yeah, you're conveying this idea clearly, I think is very important. The second is this idea of being overambitious. I think many of us have this tendency to really say, I want to solve all problems. But I think the key is to really sort of be focused and be concise and be realistic about what's possible in the time frame. And then the third thing I was going to say, I didn't have a chance to type it in, but I'll just mention it verbally now, is this idea that I think all of us know that nothing is going to be perfect. But it's much better for us as a grant writer, for me as a grant writer, to be able to be clear about the fact that I recognize that there are limitations and there are potentially alternative approaches, and to make that explicit in the grant application. Because if a reviewer says, hey, why didn't you think of X, Y, or Z, they will give you a much lower score than if they say, oh, wow, you recognize that you could have done X, Y, or Z, and that this is a potential limitation of your current approach. They'll be, I think, more appreciative than if they sort of say, why didn't you mention that potential limitation? So those are the sort of three ideas I have. I don't know, Shivani, if you have anything else you wish to add.
No, I think you've hit it. And I would say that, I would just say maybe flipping two considerations. So first, thinking about whether your scope is too ambitious or not, right? Like, so first, the concept itself has to be very well defined. It has to be feasible, actionable with your resources, with your skill set. You have to have the alignment and all those things. And then, of course, the second part is making sure that you clearly convey it. And I think Rajesh has already provided excellent suggestions for how using external feedback from people who are not related to the grant, right? Like that is going to be an essential tool. And a part of that is also preparing early enough, right, that you actually have the time for revisions. We have a tendency of, I think this is part of our overambition, to work in new things until the last minute, but it's always going to pay off more to finish earlier, maybe do less, but be more clear about it. Those are just my additional thoughts.
And then there was a question about optimal level of complexity. Is it better to have a singular focus or aim, or to have multiple aspects? Again, in my head, I think the key is really to have sort of alignment, coherence, and consistency in the proposal. So I think it's possible to have different components or different foci, obviously different aims, but there needs to be sort of a coherent story and a way to sort of bring it all together. And I think that's the key in terms of that question. Those are my thoughts there. Shivani, anything you wish to add?
I think that grant writing is a highly structured process. So the other thing is, studying past grants that have been successful for that particular mechanism. So one of the things I've learned working with my primary global collaborators are all in India. So when I study locally submitted grants, they're not necessarily as structured, as formulaic, meaning there's a little bit more leeway with what appears where. In an NIH grant, for example, it is very fixed. Every reader and reviewer is expecting certain content to be in certain sections. So I think that the alignment also needs to happen there. And again, I think the best way to learn is by studying past submissions and having those kinds of discussions, because it'll feel like a very opaque system, right? And I think getting that experience and those examples will really help you out in your first time at it.
And Shivani, actually related to that point, there was a question about, is there a place to be able to access previously successful grant applications?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So I think I know that especially for career development awards, there are really good examples online that are published. I think also for bio sketches, I guess we haven't hit on that, but that's again, one of those components where we really have to explain to our colleagues that we cannot take your curriculum vitae in the form that it is, but the NIH requires a very specific, very specific format for the CVs. And you can find those examples online. But I think the other way of going about it is reaching out to colleagues, or even you can cold email people, right, who are in your field that you respect. One way you can understand what research is out there is through NIH Reporter. Maybe you've had experience with that. That will give you a public listing of what grants are funded by the institute you're seeking to target. And you'll also be able to understand who's received that funding, what their publications are, et cetera, et cetera. So I encourage you to reach out. I think especially people in global health, it attracts a certain kind of spirit, a collaborative spirit. So I think you'll find that a lot of people are willing to share, and maybe not, and everyone might not be. Don't take that personally, because sometimes there's also sort of intellectual inputs. So for me, for example, I don't write any of these grants by myself. It's always this massive team effort. So I need to have all of my team members agree before I share, but do definitely reach out, I think, to others. And maybe Rajesh, you know about a repository, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, especially for this initiative and this set of RFAs, it feels like such a new endeavor that even I am planning with a couple of colleagues in different countries in Africa to think about responding to this set of RFAs. And we are also confronted by a similar challenge, like what is it going to take to be successful? And so I think maybe what we can do, Shivani, is we can reach out to the administration and see if they may have samples or maybe a little bit more explicit guidance, because even for me, this is such a new thing that I feel like it would be useful to get a sense of what might be considered to be successful in this specific context.
That's a great idea.
Great. I'm mindful of time, and I want to thank you for doing such a thorough job. A lot of thank you messages on the chat to show that you have really done a great job. Thank you so much. You've been wonderful hosts. Thank you for sharing information. Thanks for the excellent talk, as some of the participants are saying. And everyone, thank you for your participation, your engagement, your presence.